we need to guard against two serious misunderstandings of Kant that are very common. The first is that he does not take happiness into account. This is absolutely false. Kant says in a number of places that we have an ethical duty to cultivate our own happiness, as well as the happiness of those who are around us. The reason for that is that unhappiness makes us less capable of acting ethically. Essentially, it weakens the will. It's not completely different from what we today call clinical depression. It leads people to be lethargic. It leads to inaction. And inaction is rarely what ethical principles call for. Ethical principles usually command us to take some action. So this idea is captured in Kant's version of the formula that says act always as if, right? Because the emphasis there is on actually doing something, using every means that are within our power to do the right thing. So if we have an obligation to pursue happiness for Kant, a duty to do everything that we can in order to be happy, so that our unhappiness does not become an obstacle to doing the right thing, what on earth makes Kant different from Mill? And here's the most important point. You really understand Kant if you grasp this. The only thing Kant is really worried about is that we will put happiness first above doing the right thing. Kant wants us to avoid this at all costs, because sometimes putting happiness first will lead to doing the right thing, but sometimes it won't. We need a highest principle that is more reliable than the GHP. In fact, we need a highest principle that is absolutely reliable as long as we use it correctly. And this takes us back to the most serious weakness we identified in Mill, his incoherence that we can see when we look at the issue of violating rights. Mill should have recognized that rights involve some value that go beyond happiness, because a right is valid even if it doesn't make anyone happy. We should preserve other people's rights even when they have a negative effect on happiness. So Mill and the Epicureans and the hedonists before him are using a hidden principle without telling us about it, and presumably without even realizing it themselves. Preserving the rights of others is an example of going beyond happiness, and Kant wants to articulate what might be the principle for doing that. Kant doesn't want us to ignore happiness. He only wants us to put happiness second behind doing the right thing. But again, how are we going to know what the right thing is? And again, Kant's highest moral principle is going to be a maxim testing procedure, and one way of thinking about that that's captured in the first way that he states his highest moral principle, and how he describes it afterwards, is to ask ourselves whether we could will a world where our subjective principle, our maxim, is made into an objective principle, a universal law that everyone would necessarily have to follow. In looking at maxims, we note a few really important points. First, they always apply to a particular type of situation. We'll see when Kant gives some examples of maxims at the end of this reading that they always start with a whenever clause. So the form of a maxim goes like this. Whenever I find myself in a certain sort of situation, I will take this sort of action. And that whenever clause expresses the ethically relevant circumstances in a certain type of situation. What I mean by ethically relevant is they would be certain details of the situation that would make a difference to how I might judge the situation ethically. So if I said, whenever I find myself in a situation where there's a person in need who is less than 5 feet tall, I will help them. It's actually really hard to imagine a situation where someone's height is the deciding factor in whether an action is going to be right or wrong. So I would need to erase the height requirement from my maxim. It's not morally relevant. But what about this? Whenever I'm in a situation where someone else needs help, but to help them, I would have to deprive other people of something I owe them, I will. That phrase in italics could very well make a difference to which actions I think are right or wrong in the situation. So that's a morally relevant specific fact. Ideally, a maxim should include all the morally relevant facts, but it should also be general and broad enough to cover a range of cases, a range of possible opportunities for action, not just one single moment in time, a situation that could never occur again. It has to be personal and individual to me as my personal policy, but as a policy, it has to apply to more than one precise individual situation. Now, exactly how broadly to formulate the maxim is always a bit of a judgment call. And now it's time for the second major misunderstanding I mentioned a while ago, and that's the idea that Kant does not take the consequences of our actions into account. This idea is false. Kant absolutely holds us ethically responsible for the foreseeable consequences of our actions. And those foreseeable consequences must be written into the whenever clause of the maxim, precisely because they're morally relevant. Let me try an example on you. I'm in a situation where my friend asks me for help moving from one apartment to another. Now, she helped me last time I moved, and I feel I'm obligated to return the favor. Plus, it's a general principle for Kant that we should help others when they're in need and we're able to help them. But remember, Kant's criterion is to test the maxim for universality. I will the world question. I'm in good health, pretty strong. I can lift heavy stuff without injuring myself, but my grandmother, whom I live with, is in her late 70s and diabetic, so she's at special risk of the coronavirus. Her chance of dying if she gets infected is really pretty high. And I also know that some of the other friends who are going to help my friend move don't wear masks and they don't socially distance because they know that COVID-19 is not that risky for them. If they get sick, their chances of dying from the thing are pretty low. So they've decided to take what is for them acceptable risks. They're not that careful. So I have to put some reference to these factors into account because they could be morally relevant to the decision. So then I come up with a maxim, something like this. Whenever someone needs my help with something that is not a life and death matter, but helping them would put another person at possibly lethal risk, I will, deliberately not giving you the rest of the maxim that would correspond to different options. These foreseeable consequences of my grandmother being at much greater risk, those morally relevant circumstances belong in the maxim precisely because they are morally relevant details of the situation. I can't describe the moral situation without describing those. So let's go back to this world-making language. Here's the question that corresponds to that maxim that I started writing. Can I will a world where vulnerable people die because a person helped someone with a non-life-threatening need? Chances are I can't. But we'll need to get more specific about why a bit later in Kant in the next reading. And when you're writing the second version of your paper, where you apply Kant either to the article you used in the first paper or a new article, you're going to put each of your options into a maxim. So you'll have a total of 4 options. The whenever clause will be the same for each maxim because the morally relevant circumstances of the situation itself, is the same for each maxim. The second clause, the I will clause that specifies the action, will be different according to what action the option would correspond to. And maybe the hardest part of the paper, not just of the second draft, but the hardest part of the paper entirely, is writing those maxims. So I'm going to give you some practice doing that.